It is, and you always hear a speaker say, a guy who's doing introductions, it's my privilege to introduce. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Natalie Carnes. I don't know how many books on or about beauty I have read, something between 30 and 35, I think. She wrote my favorite book, the one that she's going to be expounding in part for us today. The only thing I regret is that we don't have 2 weeks to dedicate to having her shepherd us through her book. Dr. Carnes here's the official line, she's Associate Professor of Theology at Baylor in Waco. She received her A.B. in Comparative Religious Studies from Harvard, her M.A. in Religion at the University of Chicago, and Ph.D. from Duke. Her work covered constructive theology approach to less traditional themes like images, iconoclasm, beauty, gender, and childhood. Her new book, titled Image and Presence, a Christological Reflection on Iconoclasm and Iconophilia, will be out this December, and her upcoming new work, explores questions of the intersections of poverty, aesthetics, luxury, and art. Her first book, Beauty, A Theological Engagement with Gregory of Nyssa, brings her to us today. She lives in Waco, of course, her home for the last 6 years, with her husband and her 3 kids who are sick. So be praying for her kids. They're not well, and here she is. Shannon, too. Yeah, Shannon's here. And Max is being Max and sick. So we need to pray for Shannon, too. This morning, Dr. Carnes is going to show us how our mishandling of beauty, has led to some serious consequences. She will also remind us of the healing quality of timeless beauty through her exposition of this 4th century Cappadocian monk father named Gregory of Nyssa. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Natalie Carnes.
Thank you for that generous introduction. It is good to be here with you today. It is good to be meeting so many generous and hospitable spirits. It is good to be able to hear these raw and powerful words from Garrett and Janae. And it's good to have your attention when I know you all are hurtling towards finals and final projects and papers. So I appreciate you pausing with me today for a few minutes to think about beauty. Thinking about you guys and where you are in the semester sort of took me back to my own experience as an undergraduate when I was also writing final papers, and it brought to mind a research study that I did for an American history class. I decided to try to figure out the way that the words beauty and beautiful were used most often in Revolutionary period newspapers. And what I found was this. Beauty was most often used to refer to ships and horses. Make of that what you will. I hope you weren't expecting something too profound. It does seem far from our world today. Today, if you pick up a newspaper or magazine, beauty is often a whole section, and it names different products that you can use to make yourself attractive. It's sort of like the print analog to when you walk into a drugstore, and there are sections in the drugstore that are called beauty, which also sell these products, lotions, cosmetics, hair products, etc. Beauty today is often associated with those market forces that pressure us, especially women, to meet or approximate cultural standards of attractiveness. So what kind of beauty is this? Doesn't seem very theologically robust or divinely significant. In fact, this type of beauty seems silly or superfluous. Far from those things of real and lasting significance. And silliness isn't even the worst of it. Beauty's history is darker still. Women and men don't just buy products to become beautiful. They starve themselves, they harm themselves, they lose touch with the good things of life. We get ourselves into real trouble when we attempt to identify our perceptions of beauty with divinity. We don't have to look much farther than the Nazis, those great lovers of art and beauty, who tried to carve up a master race in their own image of beauty. Or to one of the great works of literature, Toni Morrison's book, The Bluest Eye, in which young black Pekala is destroyed by the way whiteness and beauty are inseparably yoked in her world. Morrison evokes the hatred, the isolation that bears on Pekala as her blackness is interpreted to her as ugliness. Morrison writes, "Long hours she sat looking in the mirror, trying to discover the secret of her ugliness, the ugliness that made her ignored and despised at school by teachers and classmates alike." Morrison blisters beauty with her story of a girl destroyed by society's valuations of beauty. And then, of course, there's the problem of the way that beauty gets assimilated to class. After all, the rich own more of the things called beautiful, they comprise more of the people deemed beautiful, and they possess more power to determine what object, situation, or person deserves to be considered beautiful. Those who do not share the richest judgments about beauty are marked as inferior. Simone Weil powerfully frames the problem of beauty's implication and wealth by inverting the terms. She says, "The horror of poverty is essentially a horror of ugliness." So beauty's been leveraged in ways that wound us, with legacies of misogyny, class hatred, and racial injustice. And yet, I want to suggest that beauty tends those same wounds and can be found in those same wounds. For beauty is a name for God. The tradition of taking beauty to be a name for God, like love or truth, is deep in the Christian tradition, both in the East and in the West. "Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and so new," Augustine cries in the Confessions. Gregory of Nyssa, meditating on Moses' ascent up Mount Sinai, describes the way that beauty calls to him, as it calls to us, summoning us ever higher to deeper participation in the divine life. Yet at the same time, the beauty we find and name in the world can as often take us away from God as toward God. Beauty wounds, but wounded beauty also heals. Or to put it in a slightly different way, beauty is a name for God, but we must not deify our conceptions of beauty. This paradox will be a refrain of sorts for us today, one I want to focus our minds and our spirits. Beauty is a name for God, but we must not deify our conceptions of beauty. Our conceptions of beauty instead have to be reformed, extended, transformed, so that they are faithful to the beautiful one, whose greatest revelation is in the wounded form of the cross. We need a way to wrestle through a God who is beauty, and yet remains near to the suffering, marginal, scarred, ravaged places of the world. For throughout centuries of Christian art, literature, and theology, there runs both this celebration and this disavowal. In one strand, beauty is the central marker of the divine. In another, suffering is. So Jesus, the image of the invisible God, is central in these traditions. In one strand, Jesus is the new Adam, the one who displays for us a humanity unmarred by sin, humanity as it was intended to be, humanity restored to its original beauty. How could Christ, very God and perfect human, not be beautiful? You can see the beauty of Christ represented as the perfect human, for example, in the center of Michelangelo's painting of the Last Judgment, when Christ, young, strong, and beautiful, stands haloed on a cloud. He is luminous in his beauty, displaying for all the perfection of his human form. You can also see this visually perfect Christ in the delicate beauty of Fra Angelico's resurrected Christ. His head covered in golden locks perfectly in place, his body draped in a white garment completely unsullied. In Angelico's painting, Christ's posture suggests perfect movement and perfect stillness, perfect balance. Behold the man. But the other side of this paradox is also present in the artistic tradition, and this other side sees a suffering God and worries about beauty. God is beauty, we remember, but we must not deify our conceptions of beauty. So this other strand of the artistic tradition in Christianity eschews obvious beauty as if despairing of its capacity to lead us to God, and focuses instead on suffering and affliction. Often this art is centered on the crucifix, as Matthias Grunewald's Isenheim altarpiece. In it, Christ's head is bowed, his mouth hangs open, his arms stretch in a wide V while his legs twine together. His body is shaped like a chalice, and from it blood flows in thick drops. His fingers are splayed, tensed, it seems, in a pain response that contrasts with his slackened head and mouth. The thorns in this image do not just encircle Christ's scalp, they cover it like hair. Christ suffers from a skin affliction shared by many of those who first looked at this image. It was hung in a hospital chapel of a monastery that cared for the afflicted with skin diseases. Those suffering from skin afflictions could look up at the cross and see a God suffering from the same. This is not Jesus in the prime of his life, strong, physically perfect, and haloed with light. This is Jesus moments from death, gruesome, suffering, ugly even. Where is the God who is beauty here? What do we make of these two different traditions? How do we reconcile the paradox of a God who seems both to be and not be beautiful? What might it mean that beauty is a name for God? We need to hold on to beauty, but we also need our perceptions of beauty reformed. While it is sometimes true that in our perceptions of beauty we might catch a glimpse of God, it is importantly true that who God reveals God's self to be, can help us become better perceivers of beauty. It might seem that in identifying with the suffering and the afflicted, God renounces the title of beauty, perhaps even renounces divinity itself. But I want to suggest, in line with an old theological tradition, that the opposite is actually the case. It is characteristic of who God is that God is found in what is not God. That the God found in suffering helps us to better see what beauty is. This is a traditional theological argument, though not necessarily an obvious one. The question of whether God might be compromised by suffering runs through the very heart of Christian history. In the first few centuries of Christianity, Christians struggled to explain how God could be, on the one hand, the all-powerful creator, and yet also the same one revealed in the human life of Jesus. Some argued that Jesus was not really human, others that Jesus was not fully divine. It seemed impossible that Christ could be both fully divine and fully human. Some argued it is not fitting, not beautiful really, that God could become human. It compromises for these people God's godness. And fittingness, in fact, was a crucial term over which one of the fiercest battles of Christology was fought. The Neo-Arians used fittingness to claim that Jesus was less than fully divine. In his great catechetical oration, Gregory of Nyssa responds to this charge. His argument moves from the defense to the offense as he describes the supreme fittingness of the incarnation. As a doctor tends to those who are sick, so he says the one thing that really befits God's nature is to come to the aid of those who are in need. Care for the needy, we might call it mercy or charity, speaks for Gregory to who God most truly is. God's taking on flesh is an expression of love that does not compromise God's divinity, but reveals God's identity as love that goes out toward the other. This, after all, Gregory argues, is what God does in creation. When God unites with the cosmos by bringing and holding it into existence, remaining intimate with it at every single moment. As creator, God is already present to and with the universe, from the brightest star to the tiniest speck of dirt. God's not polluted by this creation union, Gregory argues, so why would God be polluted by the incarnation union? So in creation, God goes out of God's self to create what is not God and give what is not God life. In the incarnation, God goes out to not God, bringing not God back to life. And this activity in creation, incarnation, echoes something of the divine life, of how God is and God's self. God's movement toward not God echoes each Trinitarian members' movement toward one another, in which the Father donates the Father's own self to the Son, who donates the Son's own self to the Spirit, who donates the Spirit's own self to the Father, and so on. Within the three persons of the Trinity, God lives in a communion of giving and receiving. In each person, God ceaselessly goes out toward the other person. The Father gives to the not Father and receives from the not Father. The Son to and from the not Son. The Spirit to and from the not Spirit. So creation and incarnation are economic refractions of God's inner life of giving and receiving, which is a theological way of saying that they are God's inner life writ into relation with what is not God. So we should not be surprised that God is always coming to us by way of what is not God. This movement of deep unity and difference is constitutive of the divine life. The cross is a further iteration of this deep unity, in which divinity goes out toward not divinity. It is divine life displayed not just through life with not God, which is creation, or just through life with not God in need, which is the incarnation. In the cross, we see divine life glimpsed through a world of violence and torture. It is the divine gift, even unto death. Under the conditions of need and suffering, the divine life seeps into the deepest and darkest cracks of existence. It goes all the way down to where the lack of divinity is most acute, to where deprivation is greatest. In a sinful world, the divine life takes the form of grotesque mercy or charity. The character of God as mercy is clarified in one of the most preached upon texts of the Christian tradition, especially in the early centuries of Christianity. It's the radical identification of God with poverty when Christ declares in Matthew 25 that what is done or not done to the least of these, the hungry, the naked, the sick, the imprisoned, is done or not done unto him. That God is charity means that Christ is especially present in those the world has forgotten or rejected, precisely because they have been forgotten and rejected. Christ's presence to those on the margins means that beauty is found in the ravaged and scarred places of the world, even as beauty is not identical with those ravages. The scars of poverty are themselves ugly, even as their ugliness renders them important sites of beauty, of God's presence in the world. What Christ renders present is, bear with me, that which goes out toward that which lacks that which goes out. This is the love that overflows to poverty and suffering. Because God is mercy, God is the one who goes out to the one in need. Beauty is the going out of charity. I think this is dramatized with special poignancy when Gregory preaches on Matthew 25 himself, and he preaches on it as a devastating famine has overtaken his land. His older brother, Basil, has started a poor hospice, which some call the first hospital. And in this poor hospice, which takes in those who have been ravaged by the famine, so disease, poverty, and hunger are all sort of intertwined here. And Gregory preaches the sermons on the love of the poor. And in these sermons, he speaks of the poor, and he means the lepers, the starving, and those who are otherwise marginalized and once members of society. He first reprimands the wealthy for gorging themselves, and then turns to the starvation of the poor. He launches into a subject with a ferocious critique. What good does it serve you to observe a strict frugality at home if you unjustly steal from the poor? What kind of piety teaches you to drink water while you hatch plots and drink the blood of the man you have shamefully treated? The wealthy's luxury brutalizes the poor. It turns them into brute beasts who, in Gregory's words, hide in the cracks of the walls like owls and drink from the spring, he says, like animals. But no sooner has Gregory sketched this image of the poor as dehumanized than he juxtaposes that image with another. Those who see the poor only as bestialized need to look closer. Upon considering who the poor are, the viewer will discover that they bear the face or prosopon of the Lord, the countenance of God. The Lord in his goodness has given the poor his own countenance in order that it might cause the hard-hearted, those who hate the poor, to blush with shame, Gregory writes, to tremble with fear. He claims, the poor are the stewards of our hope, the doorkeepers of the kingdom, who open the door to the righteous and close it again to the unloving misanthropists. For the deeds done to them cries out to the one who fathoms the heart in a voice clearer than a herald's trumpet. The poor here are those who open the doors to the kingdom of God. From their bestialized position in the cracks of walls, they are elevated to those with the right to a kind of supreme participation in judgment. And what of the wealthy, those who devise clever traps, Gregory says, so as to eat every kind of animal they see? Well, they exhibit the kind of bloodlust that will not rest content in temperate relaxation, but will bestialize the bodies of the poor, as the poor drag themselves along painfully with amputated feet, perhaps crawling or mutilated or with gouged out eyes. Where are the rich who might give them food? At their loud banquets of excess, unable to hear the cries of the poor over the raucous music and cackling, bawling laughter. When the poor beg more loudly, the rich treat them worse than their own animals. They set their dogs on them. So Gregory at this point starts moving quickly between the images of the poor and the images of the rich. Accordingly, the poor retreat, the beloved of Christ, who embody the essential commandment without having gained one mouthful of bread or meat, but satiated with insults and blows. And in the den of mammon, the rich vomit up their meal like an overflowing vessel. Others sleep on the table, their wine cups beside them. Bestialized or not, it's not the poor who are painted as disgusting in this tableau. Gregory's rhetoric reaches a climactic pitch, his intensity growing as if he himself wants to shout through the loud and bawdy banquet of the rich. If God sees these scenes, he says, and I'm sure he does, what fatal catastrophe do you think does he hold in store for those who hate the poor? Answer me. Or do you not know that it is to this end that the Holy Gospel shouts out and testifies with scenes of horror and dread? It is not just that the poor have Christ's face, Gregory reminds his congregants, but that Christ says, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was stranger, naked, sick, a prisoner. To care for the poor is to care for Christ. It is to see for yourself the realization of the good news. Gregory reads the poor into the story of the Good Samaritan, and then brings them before the mind's eye of his audience as even more explicitly bestialized. Their frightful malady has changed them into beasts, barely recognizable as humans. These people who yesterday stood upright and looked at the sky are here today bending to the earth, walking on 4 feet, practically changed into animals. Listen to the rasping wheeze that comes from their chest. Thus it is that they breathe. At the same time that Gregory describes the afflicted so gruesomely, he excoriates the rich for the form their horror takes, for failing to recognize the afflicted as brothers. Yet such horror can be useful to the rich and can also be cured if the rich consider the fall from health to affliction in humans against the infinitely greater descent from the king of celestial bliss to stinking and unclean flesh, as Gregory calls it. The incarnation is thus a balm for the rich's horror, which Gregory reforms by following the bestial images of the poor with an insistence that the poor are no different in their nature from the satiated rich. Reshaping the horror of the rich, Gregory does not want them to lose their horror because he wants them fully sensitized to the material reality of the afflicted. Thus, Gregory insists that the poor should see the wandering men who are scattered along our roads, he says, like cattle foraging for nourishment, clothed in wretched rags. Yet at the same time that he sees this material reality, he also wants them to see them as humans born in the image of God, entrusted with the governance of the earth and the rule over all creatures. Gregory is trying to hold on to his congregants' attention, to try to force their attention to the poor in a way that calls them to action. By healing their bodies of ulcers, hunger, and suffering, he preaches, the satiated, the rich, can themselves be healed of their own greed and sin so that they may be received into the kingdom. Admitting that it is indeed hard to master a natural aversion to such ugly suffering, Gregory presses his congregants nonetheless to do just that. Are we, with so much at stake, going to choose the pleasant, smooth path and beat a retreat in the face of the steep path of virtue? You will cure your aversion, Gregory claims, by simply persevering in exercise of care for the sick. Like all forms of exercise, it will be difficult at the beginning, but enjoyable, even sweet in the long term. And such care for the sick is profitable for the healthy. Gregory explains why. For it is beautiful for the soul to provide mercy to those who have fallen on misfortune. And so here we're back to beauty. You may have wondered if we were going to come back. In these sermons of Gregory, beauty is the visibility of the love that goes forth in imitation of the God who is love going forth. There is no tension between the God of suffering and the God of beauty, for mercy, the movement towards sickness, is the visibility of beauty. And this need to which mercy responds includes, but is not reducible to poverty and its ravages. For the rich are also healed in their encounters with the poor. The love that makes God visible is care-filled attention to ugliness. The ugliness this love attends is the dehumanization of the afflicted, an ugliness never separated from the beauty of the afflicted, whose beauty also discloses Christ, whose beauty also discloses God's image. To see God in the world requires seeing the half-dead human dragging herself along the road, the starved lepers foraging for food like cattle, the ostracized sick hiding owl-like in the cracks of walls. Gregory wants poverty neither to be invisible nor normal. To see poverty is to respond with the care the afflicted need and with the hope that the afflicted might yet heal the materially advantaged sin-sick, whom they might one day let into the kingdom. The response of hope and care is the act of charity to which Gregory commends his audience. It is here, in this place where soul sickness meets body sickness, bloated greed meets decaying limbs, bloodlusty meets hunger racked, where we find beauty. The divine presence in grotesque suffering is not a departure from the divine life, but characteristic of it. And that movement into the grotesque is not antagonistic to beauty, but the revelation of it. God's faithfulness goes by way of intimacy with not God, and beauty by way of the grotesque. The beauty that rejects suffering is false, and the one who follows the call of beauty faithfully will find herself in the scarred places of the world. Beauty, after all, is a name for God. And God does not abandon divinity in identifying with the suffering and afflicted, but expresses through such identification the very marker of divine life. This is not to say that suffering, affliction, or poverty is beautiful. Beauty is distinct from the mode of its arriving. Poverty and suffering can be important sites of beauty, even as they are not themselves beautiful, because they mediate the beauty of the God who is charity. In a world of violence and death, the going forth beauty of the God who is charity envelops itself in the grotesque. God, who is beauty, becomes present to those who are in need, the afflicted, the hungry, the naked, the unsheltered, the imprisoned, the strangers. As the visibility of mercy, beauty becomes most fully itself in the movement toward that which is not itself. This is the beauty that refuses the sundering of the life-exuding glory from the suffering and dying divinity. It is beauty that goes out toward the margins of the world, moving continually from glory to suffering, a beauty that is found in their merciful embrace. Praise be to God. Amen.